a law or right to do whatever we want to do,
Right, you're right about it.
the way we want to do it.
Right,
We have laws and we have statutes, and they say don't, and some say do.
right,
Then God, in His infinite wisdom, has given us some Christian freedom.
right,
Christian freedom, Paul says, is it does not give you the right to do your own thing
that's right,
with what God has created.
already.
There is a difference between God's law
Yeah,
and man's law.
that's right,
There's a difference between God's way and man's way.
right,
And so we need to understand, just because we have Christian privilege, we have freedom to make choices.
yeah,
Our choices should be to glorify God.
you're right about it.
Our first choice should be to glorify God. And when we go through the thinking process, it's like this. Is what I'm about to do,
Yeah,
does it glorify God?
uh-huh,
That's a good checking point
right,
that we need to do. If you really want to better understand it, come and go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10,
man,
and then chapter 9 right above that. If you got the King James, it's roughly probably from verses 25 through 27 of chapter 9, and then we'll go into 10. When you get home, you need to read those two chapters, because Paul is making an appeal about Christian freedom.
yeah.
And, once we've been clean, we all not go back
Oh, that's right.
to where we've been, got dirty again.
Yeah,
Don't be like the little boy on the TV when his mom cleaned him up from the mud puddle. As soon as she opened the door, he went right back to that mud puddle and jumped right in it. And so, as Christians, we don't want to do that. Go back to the muck and the mire. Amen?
That's right.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Let's read verses 25 through 27 of that 9th chapter, and then we'll go into chapter 10. Is that all right? And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperated in all things.
Yeah,
Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I not as one that beateth the air. But I keep under my body and bring it unto submission, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Then he goes into chapter 10, and he says, moreover, brethren, I would not that you would be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat,
right,
and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock
yeah,
that followed them, and that rock was
Yeah.
Christ.
that's it.
But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness.
Yeah,
Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things,
right,
as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in a day 23,000.
Yeah.
Now skip down to verse 11. Now all these things happen unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come.
right,
Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. There hath no temptation taken you, but as such is common to man. But God is faithful,
right,
who will not suffer you to be tempted above that all you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry.
right,
I speak as to wise men, judge you what I say. I'd like to talk to you from this thought: God's way versus man's way.
mighty good there, pal.
God's way versus man's way. Now, Paul is talking to us And Paul has always given us some good information. He's one of the most prolific preachers of the New Testament era. Paul, I like the way he teaches because he explains along the way. In order to explain or understand chapter 10, he has you to go back to chapter 9, and he says, you know, we all strive for the master. We all do some things. Right. But in this world of Christianity, you do have some folk who not strive for the prize of the higher calling. They strive for an uncorruptible crown.
Tell it.
In other words, give me money.
Yeah.
I'm hanging with you because I like position. I'm hanging with you because I like power. And so we have people who are Christians, so-called Christians, Paul says, who are striving for an uncorruptible crown. He said, but you ought to have learned from the past that you don't strive for an uncorruptible crown. You just keep working and staying there. Be like a runner. You're not running just to beat the air. Be like a runner that you're running for the prize. Don't just go through the motion for it. Right. So he says that you ought to learn examples, the same thing we use examples of those who faltered before the way. Now, Paul is talking to the Jewish people who have relented after all that he's done. They are adultery worship. And they are arguing over things like, well, should we eat meat that will offer to idols? Paul said, don't get caught up in all of that. He said, in other words, if you have an adulterer, if you have someone who don't even sit at his table, don't even entertain with him because his goal is not your goal. And so we need to understand that God has given us spiritual freedom, and sometimes we use our freedom to make the wrong decision. Let me help you here. We know that we are diabetical. And we know there's certain things we ought not have.
That's right. Tell it.
But we go ahead and eat that triple chocolate cake. And then we get sick over through the night.
Yeah.
And then we start saying, you know, that devil, he's a lie. No, devil didn't do that.
You let it.
That's your decision.
Right.
And so we need to understand that God gives us freedom of choice.
Right.
And sometimes we make the wrong decision.
Right.
Now let me meddle a little bit.
Go ahead.
You went on the internet and you think you found your boo. I got to meddle a little bit. And you think you done found your boo, and God keep telling, don't mess with him.
Then leave it alone.
You ask him about Christ, and he says, who, Jesus? See, you need to understand that the thing is that you need to leave him alone. But yeah, you pick him.
Yeah.
And then you found out he's a rascal.
Yeah.
No, God didn't help you do that.
No.
That's your choice.
That's right. Tell it.
And so God gives us spiritual freedom.
Yeah, he does.
And so we have to understand. Now I'm just messing with y'all.
That's all right.
But it's true in that saying is that we can make some wrong decisions.
Tell it.
Sister Lee told me the other night she didn't make the wrong decision. We've been married a long time. And I'm going to send her a card and say, you still my Valentine.
Yeah.
Been over 20-some years and I ain't mad with you. There's no regrets. Ain't that right, Sister Lee? Help me preach this message. And so there are some things that we need to understand as Christians that we just ought not do.
Right.
And so Paul is going through that. He says, don't sit down. If somebody tell you that we're going to celebrate Venus, and that was one of the gods that they have over there, the thing about it is that don't sit down and don't deal with them.
That's right.
You got to watch folk who walk around with a big medallion on, talking about that's their lucky medallion. You don't hang with folk like that.
Man.
You know, you have to understand that anybody that is serving God plus something,
Oh, something wrong.
is something wrong with that.
Yeah.
You know, if I had 4 or 5 more to help me go along,
Well,
we get through with this.
Come on with it.
But in spiritual freedom, Paul says the Jews are telling you wrong.
Yeah, they are.
And so they are worshiping, and they know what I did. Moses passed through the flood.
Yeah.
The thing about it is that Noah passed through.
Right.
It was nobody but God who did that.
Right.
Now, why would you want to go back? And then some of the fathers lost their lives due to, in the wilderness, not going along with my program.
Right.
Why would you make the same mistake? That's like me going down the road. I see somebody else run into a ditch
Yeah.
because there's ice on the road.
Yeah.
But I said, it ain't going to happen to my car.
I know that's right.
I'm driving a 4-wheel, plus I got spiked tires, and I ain't going to worry about it. And then you end up in the ditch. Why repeat something
Yeah.
that our forefathers have done.
Already.
We don't want to do that. And so God says you give you spiritual freedom. God gives us free will.
Yeah.
He doesn't bid. He knows all that's going to come to him. He don't force anybody to do anything. He gives you free wisdom. He gives you wisdom and you have a free will. And Paul says in verse 11, he said, all these things happen for an example. Use other people's lives as an example. Not to criticize, but use their lives as an example. Moses, where did you mess up? I messed up when God told me to speak to the rock and I struck it. Yeah. That's where I messed up. Where did you mess up, David? Well, I should have been on the battlefield. But no, I said to myself, you need to take some time off. And I said to myself, I need to go up on the rooftop.
Oh, Lord.
And then I said to myself, look around. And then myself looked around and there was Bathsheba
Yeah.
taking a bath on the top.
Yeah.
Now I know I shouldn't have done it,
Right.
but I ended up hooking up with Bathsheba.
Oh, Lord.
That's where I went wrong. We need to learn from other people's example. And yet God still used them.
Yeah.
He wasn't pleased with what they did. But guess what? He says David is a man after my own heart. And so we have to understand, but that didn't make it right. He gave David some free will.
Yes.
But guess what? David used some wrong thing, but yet God had a purpose for his life.
Yeah, he did.
Now that does not give us the right to go out and sin.
Right.
But if we do, we have an advocate
Yeah.
Right.
sitting at the right hand of the Father,
Right.
making intercessions for us.
Right.
But Paul says that we ought to flee the very appearance of evil.
Right.
Paul says, even though you're strong, you need to be careful how you talk about you're going to stand on your own. It's in the text, read it. He said, before you can help somebody else, you need to make sure you're strong.
Right.
Yeah.
You want an alcoholic, and you've been helped, and now you're going to tell somebody about not going in a bar and talking about alcoholic and get to talking about football games and old times, and then you fall into the same trap. You need to make sure you're strong.
Yeah.
And so we need to understand that's like a guy who once was a smoker go into a tobacco shop. It smells good.
Yeah.
And sometimes your mind will flake back.
Right.
And so we have to understand, he says, when you go to help your brother, you ought to be strong
Right.
in the word and the way. And God will help you with that. He says, and if you are tempted, and this is where we get this, God don't put no more on you than you can bear.
That's the word. That's the
That's
word.
true. That's true. But you can tempt God.
Right.
When Jesus come up out of the wilderness, he come up out of the water, spirit is on him.
Yeah.
He goes straightway into the wilderness, and what does Satan tell him? You're the king.
Yeah.
You're the son of God. You know he's not going to let anything happen. Just jump down, and even if you dash your foot against a stone, God is going to help. Don't tempt God.
That's right.
You know what tempting God is? It's like some of these kids nowadays walking in the middle of the street. I can't understand that. You got a sidewalk on both sides, and they walking in the street and turn around and look at you like, what the heck you doing? That's tempting God.
Right.
That's tempting faith.
Right.
That's like me saying, well, I tell you what, I'm going to stop. It's an 18-wheeler coming by, but I'm going to show him. I'm going to stop right here. No, that's tempting faith.
Right.
Get out of the way and let him go. See, God gives us free will, and we have to make some decisions. Sometimes the decisions are tough. But guess what? He's given us the Holy Spirit to lead and guide us along the way.
Yes.
He says, if you insist on using your rights, you may cause a weaker believer to stumble, or you could bring trouble your way. Let me help you with that weaker. New converts just come into the church. I know that it's all right to have wine with my supper,
Okay.
or wine with my dinner,
Okay.
Yeah.
whether it be red, white, or dark purple. I have that right.
Yeah.
And I understand the privilege of what God allows me to do.
Right.
But then I invite some new converts,
Yeah.
who one of them happened to, brother Paul, that happened to be an alcoholic.
Oh, Lord.
But he's trying to work with God and we take him out, and I say, okay, hey, let's order the wine. It could cause. It's your privilege.
Uh-huh.
It's your decision.
Right.
But it could cause a young recruit to stumble.
Right. You got
So
it,
we
right.
have to understand that in our free will,
Yeah.
we have to make sure we're making the right decision. Paul says if it offends your brother,
No.
don't do it.
Right.
And so we have to understand that some of our decisions might bring pain, and I already explained that a lot of times we make decisions in our lives, in our diet, and it brings trouble on ourselves.
Yeah.
Another one, it says, I got to have that car.
Oh, Lord.
Now, it's $20,000 over what I can afford,
Oh, Lord.
but God's going to take care.
Oh, Lord.
And after 3 months,
There it is.
you decide you can't handle it. And here it is, you about to lose it. And asking everybody, it's okay, and most folk can understand if you're trying to pay for a hoopty,
Yeah.
that your notes are $200, but I'm just using some numbers here. But it's hard to go and ask somebody for $700 or $800
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
a Honda Accord.
Yeah.
You have to understand that some of our decisions can bring us pain. Are you following me here?
Well, don't bet you-
And so the thing about it is that we have to understand that we have to make good decisions.
Right.
If I can only afford a Volkswagen,
Get it.
that's what I need to get. Now, I ain't gonna get no motorcycle.
No.
Because if y'all see Pastor Lee riding a motorcycle, just call the people in the white jackets. Because I've totally lost my mind. So you have to understand that decisions
Yeah.
are based on our ability
Right.
to think what is God's way
Right.
or man's way. In this text, some of the people were doing it God's way, and some of the people were doing it man's way. Just because man makes a law, don't make it right.
Right.
If it's wrong in God's law, it's forever wrong.
Right.
Just because you can get a group of people on Capitol Hill to make a ruling,
Yeah.
don't make it right.
You right, man.
Everything that we do, we have the decision to say yes or no.
Right.
The best thing to do is don't hang with rascals.
Right.
Don't hang with folk that you know got one foot in the church and one foot out,
Right.
because they can make you mad, make some bad decisions.
Right.
I've learned, and we talk to this, and we tell our young people all the time, if you have one,
Uh-huh.
when you go somewhere, drive your own car.
There you go.
Because you don't know how somebody gonna act.
Right.
And if things get out of hand,
Get up out
you
of
can
there.
drive. How did you serve? You said get up out
Get
of
up
there.
out of there.
So in other words, the decisions you make and folk you ride with can cause you problems.
Yeah.
If you know that person, once they get 2 drinks in them,
There it is.
and they start raising stuff in there and wanting to fight, it's time to get on up out of there.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. They're going to start to fight, and then they leave. We need to understand that we also bring trouble on ourselves if we make the wrong decision, and that's what they were doing.
Right.
You remember one occasion, I think it's Matthew 16, is where Jesus is on Caesarea Philippi. He's walking, and he asks his disciples, who do men say that I am? And some say, you're John the Baptist, you're Elias, you're Isaiah. The thing about it is that when he asked Peter, he said, well, whom do you say I am? Yeah. Peter said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Go.
You know why he asked that question? Because in the mountain, there were all kind of gods, Pan and Diana and Venus and all of those ones, and everybody bowed down to them. And he was wondering, if you can bow down to that, if you can make a tribute to that, then look at the God who has done so much for you. Why don't you elevate me? And so we need to understand that God is looking for us to make the right decision, because when we make the right decision, we glorify God.
Right.
We glorify God. And so we have to understand that Paul is saying here, he says, you know, we are examples, we are intent, we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. You don't lust after anything. God is going to bless you. Ask him for it in sincerity, and he'll do it in due time. And then every now and then we do know that God will say no, and we have to deal with that. When we face difficulties or difficult decisions, take these factors into consideration. What would God have me to do? What would it be best for me and my family? What would it be best for me? Especially young people who are in college, you have to make some decisions.
Right.
Am I going to go to class? Am I going to stay and sleep in?
Oh, Lord.
Am I going to write this a paper, or am I going to write it the best of my knowledge? Or am I going to call up somebody and tell them, say, write me a paper? And then when the professor puts it in the checking point, somebody's already wrote that 3 years ago. Plagiarism. We need to understand that we can make decisions in life that can affect us for the rest of our life.
Right.
And so we have to understand. I worked with a young man who, when he loved to go to those rock concerts.
Yeah.
And he was like Snoop Dogg. He loved him some weed. I'm telling you. And he loved him some weed, and he was going to smoke him some weed, and then he'd go down and get this flush kit. And he'd try to flush everything out.
Yeah.
But the decisions that he made, he never really got caught by the company.
Yeah.
But later on down the line, so much weed smoking gave him hepatitis. And he had to have a liver transplant. Do you follow me?
Good.
Nothing in the law but mess with him.
Yeah.
Nothing, but he caused himself some pain.
Right.
And not only that, he had 2 liver transplants.
Oh, Lord.
And he's still living. What we do in life, Paul says, can affect us later on.
Right.
And I might as well, since I'm in this vein, tell you, be careful what you put on Instagram and Facebook.
Right.
Because people look at that.
That's right.
And even though you figure you're secretly texting and saying something, they got a program now that if you tweet,
Yeah.
folk can figure out exactly where you are,
That's
where
right.
you was when you sent it. And so we have to understand
Technology.
that technology works good for you, but it can also work against you.
That's right.
And so we need to understand it is a tool.
Yeah.
I'm sitting right here using it this morning, watching all of this church.
Yeah.
Technology is good,
Yeah.
but we have to understand that God is better.
Right.
And so we have to make good decisions. I'm almost through with this. This text is parallel to God's people today, and it's obvious. We have been redeemed from the world. We've been set aside. That's what it says, that we've been set aside. We are the salt. We are the light that's on a hill that's not hid under a bushel. We have been cleaned up from the world. We have been identified with Christ. That's why we wear the name Christian. And we've been nourished by the Holy Spirit. We need to understand that in all of that, we need to show ourselves Christian and real Christian,
Right.
true Christians, not going by what man say. Man does not give us the right to do whatever we want to do.
Right.
Even though they say that, guess what? We don't have that right. We belong to God. We are or should be a holy temple.
Right.
And we don't want to put anything in our temple that does not glorify God.
Right.
And so we need to understand, but even these blessings that we have does not mean that we are going to be successful in making the right decision.
Right.
Paul says, every time I would do good, evil is always present.
Right.
And then later on he says, thy word have I hid in my heart.
Right.
But I thought that I might not. Through the power of the Holy Spirit,
Right.
I might not sin against thee.
Right.
And every time when we have good intentions,
Right.
that old man creeps back up.
Land there.
So God's promise to us, and Paul says, and I'm ending this, Paul says, God knows how much we can take. God knows he knows.
Know it all.
There are some folk on our job we hate to see coming. God knows how much we can take. We've been there some years, Sister Barb, but they know how much we can take.
Yeah, they do.
And you know why God gives you escape? You know you're mad.
Yeah.
Your jaws want to say something. Your mouth and your tongue want to say something evil to get them off your back,
Yeah.
but you just kind of shake your head and walk away. That's your escape.
Yeah, you gotta get it.
And so God he knows how much we can bear. If someone is standing on your foot,
Yeah.
and they got a high heel on your toe,
Oh, Lord.
it's so much you can bear.
You right about it.
You got to tell them, get off my foot.
Yeah.
And so we need to understand that when we are carrying loads,
Yeah.
when we are burdened down,
Yeah.
God knows how much we can bear.
Right.
I've seen trailers and I've seen different automobiles. You got a half-ton truck and you want to go down and put a ton on it. It ain't going to work.
Tell it. Tell it.
I've seen the leaf springs flipped upside down.
Yeah.
I've seen trailers weaving all over the road simply because you've overloaded. Honey, let me tell you something. If you overload your body,
Yeah.
if you overload your system, it's hard
Yeah.
to be a Christian.
Right.
You need to take life as it comes. You need to make sure that you don't overload yourself. Every now and then, we burn candles from all ends,
You right about it.
simply because we don't know how to say no.
Right. Right.
If you don't manage your time, others will do it for you.
Yeah, they will.
Paul says you got some free will,
Yeah.
but that don't make it right because you choose to do your own thing. He says what you need to do is learn from past experience.
That's right.
You need to learn from that, what you have gone through. Don't go back and repeat it. Jesus knew just how much he could bear.
That's right.
Because it says in the text that in Matthew 1 evening, that he went to the garden of Olives, and he had a prayer there. He took his disciples with him and prayed, Father, if this bitter cup,
That Billy cook.
if this bitter cup can be removed,
Yeah.
in other words, then remove it. And evidently God told him, no,
Right.
you got to go all the way
Right.
because I know how much you can bear.
Uh-huh.
And Jesus says, nevertheless,
Yeah.
I'm moving on. And later on down in the text, it says that Jesus went to Calvary for me and you.
Right. Right.
He knew exactly how much he could bear.
Right.
They nailed spikes in his hands and spikes in his and hung him up. He knew just how much he could bear. They drove a spear up through his side, through his lungs. He knew just how much he could bear. And in all of that, he stopped and says, Father,
Yeah.
forgive them, for they know not what they do. He knew exactly how much he could bear. And when it was all over,
Yeah.
when he knew just how much he could bear,
Yeah.
he says, Father, it's finished.
Right.
Into thy hands I commend my spirit.
Yeah.
Isn't that good to know that you know your load limit?
Yeah.
That's why they put load limits on different things.
Right.
There is no sense in me going to get a chair and it says for 200 pounds and I sit in it, it ain't gonna work.
Tell it. Paint the picture.
We need to know spiritually what our load is.
That's right.
You know how to increase your spiritual load? You gotta pray.
Right.
You got to talk to God along the way. Remember Jabez, he says, enlarge
Yeah.
my territory.
Yeah.
And Nucci, what you got to understand is that when you ask God to enlarge your territory,
Yeah.
problems and mess comes with it.
Yeah, it does.
But in order to be able to stand there and take it, we've got to have God on our side.
That's a
Yeah.
must.
Yeah.
God is the one who will help us judge just how much we can bear. It is through Jesus Christ,
Right.
who is our supervisor.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
But even in that, Brother Chip, he gives us free will.
Yeah, it does.
You make the decision.
You.
You glorify me
Right.
with your decision.
Right.
Are you with me here?
Yes, sir. Man.
I'm through preaching to you.
All right, mighty good.
We're going to go home and watch the Rockets. God is an awesome God.
Oh, yes, he is.
And we are blessed people
Right.
because God has set us aside,
Yeah, he has.
glorified us,
Yeah.
cleaned us up.
Right.
And we need to give him the praise that's due his holy name. So if you hadn't made that definite decision, if you have not made a choice for God, if you have not made a choice for Christ, this is the time that you can come forth and accept Christ as your Lord and Savior. While the choir sing, will you come? Whether they're coming by letter, restoration of faith, or candidate for baptism. Our motto is, whosoever will, let them come.